Chapter 11, Managing Organization Design. The learning objectives for this chapter would include an understanding of the nature of organization design. We'll also be looking at the universal perspectives on organization design and the situations that may influence an organization's design, as well as how an organization's strategy is related to its design, or the relationship between organization strategy and its design. We'll be looking also at the forms of organizational design as well as the emerging issues in organizational design. The nature of organization design. Organizational design would basically be the overall set of structural elements and the relationships among those elements that are used to manage the total organization. And like we said in the former chapter, like I told you, we would be using the word department interchangeably with business units. We'll also be using it interchangeably with structures. We'll also be using it interchangeably with functions in an organization. So if you had departments, had business units, had structures, just like here it says the structural elements, or you hear functions, that all relates to the departments of an organization, which their various functions actually contribute to the organizational outcome. And there are two things that would be kept in mind when organizations go about their design, right? And the first would be that organization designs are not total. They are not just left intact, meaning that from time to time the mission or objectives or purpose of an organization may change from time to time, which means that there may be departments of an organization which over time their relevance may not be that significant towards the organizational outcomes, right? And in such cases, an organization may restructure, what we call restructuring, right? An organization may undertake restructuring in order to collapse departments or structures which aren't relevant to the organizational outcomes, or actually coming up with new departments or structures or functions that would actually contribute to organizational outcomes which aren't already existing. So not designing an organization and leaving it that way means that organizations evolve, and based on the evolution of organizations, their design may actually, or their structure may actually evolve as well, which means they could restructure to suit their new business needs or their new business mission or their new business objectives, right? Also, it says here that it's just like basically where I used to work actually back in Nigeria when I was in the industry. You find out that the telecom regulator I used to work for, initially the mission was the sale of licenses. After there was deregulation in the telecom industry, that there was the sale of licenses to new telecom providers, right? Issuing licenses to them. And afterwards, over time, the purpose or objectives of the regulatory organization I worked for had to change, because they went from having to issue or sell licenses to now having to manage those licenses. So at the initial stage, the licensing department was a core function, a core structure of this organization. But eventually, when they transited to having to manage those licenses, the licensing department had to be collapsed into the legal and regulatory services department, because they weren't doing a major function of the organization anymore, in as much as there may be new licensees, but it wasn't the major mission or objective of the commission or the organization at that point. At that point, given that the organization now wanted to be managing those licenses effectively, a new department was actually created within that organization, and the department was called the Compliance Monitoring and Enforcement Department. They were always looking out to see that those licensees of this organization, right, that they are actually compliant with whatever the provisions of those licenses are. And the enforcement part of it was to actually mete out, or to actually give fines to people who aren't compliant, or the providers, service providers, or licensees who aren't compliant with the extant regulations, right? And furthermore, on things that are to be kept in mind, one other thing would be that organization design for large organizations is extremely complex. And what does that mean? It means that for large organizations, they don't stick to one design really. Would further down see all the types of organization designs that exist out there, and we would see that most organizations, more often than not, especially the larger ones, they incorporate more than one design within their organizations. So, given that we're going to look at the universal perspectives to organization design, right, or on organization design rather, so those perspectives that are universal, they comprise two perspectives basically, and those they would include one, the bureaucratic model that was proposed by Max Weber, and you have the behavioral model as well. So on the bureaucratic model, right? So it says that a bureaucracy basically is an organization based on a legitimate and formal system of authority, right? So you find out that Weber felt bureaucracy was the one best way to do things and came up with five basic characteristics of an ideal bureaucracy. And when you say bureaucracy, basically, I would want you to liken it to an organization structure. The organization structure we talked about in the last chapter, right? When we talked about basic elements of organizing, I want you to look at it from when you say the mechanistic organization or organic organization, right? When you're talking about the bureaucracy, it's more likened to a mechanistic organization that has a tall hierarchy because most of them have a formal system of authority, right? So I would want you to liken this bureaucratic model to the mechanistic organization we discussed earlier, right? And the characteristics of such a model would include that there's distinct division of labor, right? Each position is filled by an expert, and you see such in mechanistic organizations as well, right? And there are consistent rules and uniform task performance, right? Meaning that there are set rules, right? It's a formal system, like we said earlier. Third point, or the ideal characteristics will be there's a chain of command from top to the bottom, right? A hierarchy of positions that creates for a chain of command from top to bottom. And the other fourth characteristic will be that such this model proposes that such organizations that incorporate this model have impersonal managers, right? Those managers kind of maintain an appropriate social distance from their subordinates, right? There's something it's more of a situation where you have a cadre of staff or level of seniority affecting the nature or level of interaction, right? So it's kind of differentiates the seniors from the subordinates, right? And another characteristic would be that employment and advancement is based on technical expertise, right? There are no arbitrary dismissals in such organizations that actually incorporate this model. This slide actually enumerates the strengths and weaknesses of the bureaucratic model, right? And on the strengths, you find out that several elements that are provided for by this model actually improve efficiency of such organizations, right? It could be based off the formal rules, right? The set criteria within the organization. Like, let's say, for instance, the organization also may have a set criteria or set policies for their processes, right? They could have set policies for their procedures, and that does is that it helps prevent favoritism, right? There are no arbitrary there's no arbitrariness, or there's no lack of clarity on what the policies are or what the provisions are for whatever processes within the organization. That would be one of the strengths of this model. And also, it makes procedures and practices clear to everyone, right? Like we already said. But the weaknesses would be the rigidity of such a model within organizations, right? And it's often difficult to make exceptions or change the rules because these are kind of casting stones with the policy. There are formal rules within such organizations, right? But the situations may vary, so it's sometimes necessary for there to be room for some flexibility in policies, right? But such a model wouldn't offer such flexibilities, right? And one other weakness would be that when you have it in organizations incorporating such a model, it results in the neglect of human and social processes because those rules, having to stick to those rules may actually be consciously ignoring of the human part or the human differences that should be made towards maybe employees of an organization, right? This model probably wouldn't allow for that. The behavioral model. This is a model of organization design basically that is consistent with human relations movement, and you find out that it emphasizes team working and stresses attention to the development of work groups, and it concerns itself with interpersonal processes. This behavioral model was actually developed by um, a scholar named Francis Likert, right? And this scholar actually believed that organizations or organizational processes could actually be measured and placed along a continuum that is based on 8 key processes, right? So an organization could actually be measured and placed along a continuum of 8 processes, and these 8 processes would include leadership. They can be measured based on leadership, the motivation within the organization, communication, interactions within the organization, decision making, what the decision making process is like, goal setting, process control, and what performance goals this organization has. And these 8 processes based on which organizations are measured, or these 8 processes on which basis organizations are measured, actually is the foundation for the 2 systems that are actually enumerated on this slide, right? So based on these 8 processes, organizations could actually be classified as a system 1 design, right, or a system 4 design, whereby the system 1 design is more akin to the bureaucratic model, right, and the system 4 design, which is on the other end of the continuum, is more akin to the behavioral model. On this slide, we'll be looking at the strengths and weaknesses of the behavioral model, and considering the strengths, one of it would be that human behavior is emphasized, right, and the value of organizations' employees are actually being highly considered by the behavioral model. Also, one other strength of this model is that it's a more humanistic approach to organization design, whereas the weakness is that this approach actually argues that this is one best way to design an organization, right? But that may not be true, because there are several organization designs that actually suffice depending on the type of organization or the environment in which it operates, right? And there's no one best approach actually, as we can see. So this table on this slide basically enumerates the differences between a system 1 organization design and a system 4 organization design. Situational influences on organization design. This is the view of organization design that assumes that an optimal design would be dependent on certain factors, right, that are actually relevant to the organization, and they would include or certain factors that are impactful on the organization, and they may include technology, environment of the organization size, or at what point the organization is in their life cycle, right? Core technology. So looking at the technology as a factor that would impact organizational design, technology relates to the conversion of processes, right, or the conversion processes rather that are used to transform organizational inputs into outputs, right? And you find out that multiple technologies may be used, but the most important one is called the core technology. And the core technology has 3 categories, right? And the first would be what's called the unit or small batch. This has to do with custom made products, or the products actually in small quantities and they are made to the customer specifications, right? And such products may include or technology in providing for such products, you find out that for this unit or small batch, that would include like the tailoring organization, right? A tailoring business. You find out that an organization would have their products tailored to the specifications of each customer's unique needs, right? Or if it's a print shop whereby you find out that different customers come in for different customized print products. So this would be an example of the unit or small batch. Then still on the core technology, you have the large batch of mass production, right? And that would relate to an assembly line production. This may include appliances, automobiles, right? That would fall under the large batch of mass production based on their core technology. And looking at the third category, which is like the continuous process, you find out that that has to deal with how raw materials of an organization are transformed to the finished goods by a series of machine or process transformations, right? Basically, it means that the composition of raw materials changes using such technology, and you find that in organizations that are in the oil and gas industry or in the chemicals industry. Further on the core technology, the scholar called Woodward came up with some findings, right? Basically saying that organization designs align to what technology or what core technology the organization actually adopts towards producing its goods or coming up with outputs, right? And you find out that with increased complexity comes increased levels of management, and you find out that the executive span of management has, like we said, a relatively small size of staff under their supervision, right? So at the general level, basically, Woodward found that two extreme technologies like the unit or small batch technology and the continuous process technology, right? Those two extreme technologies were similar to the System 4 organization design, right? While the middle range technology, which is like the large batch and mass production of, well, um, the middle range would be the organizations that actually adopt the large batch or mass production technologies, and you find out that these organizations are actually more akin to the System 1 designs. Environment. So we'll be looking at the environmental factors that actually impact organization design, right? There were scholars that studied the extreme forms of organizational designs, and when we say the extreme forms, or rather extreme forms of an organization's environment, right? And their studies were more of putting organizations in the perspective of mechanistic organizations, right? Given their environment, and organic organizations given their environment also. And they were more like of the opinion that mechanistic organizations are organizations that are more often than not operational in very stable environments, and these stable environments are relatively constant, like the rate of change is quite low in this environment. So you find out that organizations operational in this environment, their design would be similar to that of the bureaucratic model, or what you call the System 1 model, right? Also, the other extreme form of organizational environment that they actually studied was based off of how unstable the environment is, and they were of the opinion that organic organizations would more often than not be found in very unstable environments. And unstable environments are those ones that are characterized by uncertainties and high rate of changes, right? So you find out that organizations within these environments, that the rate of change is quite high, the dynamism of the environment is quite high. Those organizations more often than not should be organic organizations, because they are quite flexible, they are ready to adapt more easily to changes in the environment, right? Also, other scholars looking at considering an organization's environment and how that could impact an organization designs came up with two concepts. One would be the differentiation, and the other the integration, where The differentiation is all about how much division, or how, to what extent an organization actually is broken down into subunits or into departments, right? Whereby if a firm or an organization with so many subunits or departments, right, or functions or structures would be regarded as being highly differentiated, right? Whereas integration, on the other hand, is the degree to which the various subunits or departments or structures or functions of an organization have to work together in a coordinated fashion, right? Now, also, it's some scholars were of the opinion, they proposed further that the degree of differentiation and integration needed by an organization, right, will depend on how stable the environments in which they are operational is, right? If the rate of change is high or low, all those, the environmental, like the rate of change in the environment, the the extent or how high or low the rate of change is would actually impact whether the organization will be highly differentiated or highly integrated. Organizational size. Now, organizational size was also seen as one factor that influences the design of an organization, right? And organizational size is all about how many employees are within an organization. Here on the slide, it's seen as the total number of full-time or full-time equivalent employees, right? And some scholars were of the opinion that technology influences the structure in small firms, right? And how does technology impact the structure in small firms is to the extent that it allows for expansion of the product lines, right? Also, and technology also allows for reach for the customers of the organization. It also influences the structure of the organization basically, right? But the assumption is that when the organization becomes larger in size, in which what it means basically is when the organization has more or increased number of employees, right, the impact of technology actually is diminished, right? And because larger firms more often than not have more job specializations, right? And specializations here will be looking at more division of labor, right? Also, they have standard operating procedures more often than not in these larger firms, rules and regulations, and a high degree of decentralization or devolution of powers, as the case may be. Yeah. Organizational life cycle. This basically relates to the process through which organizations evolve, right? How organizations keep changing in both their structure in order to cope with changes in their environment or changes in whatever their business objectives or business or the mission of their the organization is, right? And you find out that the stages that are involved in the life cycle of an organization, there are four stages, right? And the first will be the birth stage rather, or the birth phase, which is basically the start of the business. So I would try and relate this to my time in the industry, right? I used to work for the telecom regulator, like I told you, and the birth of the business for this telecom regulator would really be after the deregulation, right? After there was deregulation of the telecom sector, meaning that the government had to hands off of the telecom business, not being the telecom providers, but providing a level playing ground for private businesses to come provide telecom services, and the government now has to take on the role of regulating those private businesses, right? So the birth of the telecom industry or telecom regulation in the country where I worked in the industry had to be, it had to it came up following the regulation of the telecom sector, and the birth of the business was more about the sale of licenses, like I must have mentioned in the earlier slide, right? Now looking at the next phase, which would be the youth phase, right? That would speak to the growth of the organization beyond the start of the business, right? And for instance, likening that to the telecom industry or the telecom regulator that I used to work for while in the industry, that would include for increased investments that happen in the telecom sector, right, or the telecom industry, the expansion of infrastructure towards the unserved and underserved customers, right, in the country where this telecom regulator was operational. And given that, picking back to this organization I used to work for, a department which is considered a structure, right, of an organization, a department was actually established to actually provide for growth in the telecom industry, if that makes sense. So this department, just like the licensing, was created at the start of business to issue licenses to new private organizations that are coming in as service provider. At this youth phase, a department or a structure was created which was called the Universal Service Provision Fund. This department was basically charged with ensuring that infrastructure was evenly distributed or made available to the unserved or underserved customers or telecom customers of this particular nation where I used to work for. Then you have where I used to work for the telecom regulator. Then you have the midlife phase, right, which is the gradual growth into stability. And you have the maturity phase, which is like when the organization has peaked in its performance or in its life cycle, and at that point they probably would decline in performance, right, or go in the reverse direction rather than just a phase process that is progressive. Now you find out that, just like we said, organizations will constantly restructure or constantly collapse some departments or constantly initiate or establish new departments, and they do that basically to cope with challenges that come with each stage of the process of this their organizational life cycle. Just like we said, they had to create structure at the birth for this telecom regulator, which is to issue licenses, and at the phase of at the youth phase of their life cycle, they had to create another structure to cope with the challenges of this youth phase, which is the expansion of infrastructure to unserved and underserved customers, right? Corporate level strategy. Usually, it's advisable that organizations try to match their corporate level strategy with their organizational design, right? Because the choice of strategy of an organization will partially determine what its design is, right? And looking at the types of corporate level strategies that exist, the first would be a single product strategy, whereby an organization is only involved in offering only one single product or service. And you find out that most often than not, if that's the corporate level strategy of the organization, that they would have within the organization the functional departmentalization, because we talked about departmentalization, customer location earlier on, right? Most often than not, they will have the functional departmentalization, whereby departments within this organization will be functional departments like the marketing department, human resource department, the finance services department, and so on and so forth. And most often than not, such organizations with this corporate level strategy have the mechanistic design, right? The hierarchical design, the tall structure design. They are most often than not operational in stable environments, like we talked about earlier on too, about situational factors that impact the design, right? Now also we'll be looking at organizations that have the related diversification corporate level strategy, and this would be an organization that has several businesses maybe that offer the same product, right? Organization that has several businesses offering similar products or similar services. For instance, maybe let's say an organization that has several organizations that are into hospitality, right? All those organizations, you find out that because they are into the same business of hospitality, the organization that is the parent organization, there will be need for high level of coordination among all these businesses that offer similar products or services under the parent organization, if that makes sense, right? Because there will be need for an integration of technology, since all these businesses, or they will most likely require the same type of technology. They also require the same type of maybe supplies to actually allow for provision of services, or to allow for manufacturing of goods, right? So there should be some form of unified distribution among the several businesses that offer this, or these several businesses of this organization that offer similar products or similar services, right? Also, there's another corporate level strategy called the unrelated diversification, which most likely you will see in what you call conglomerates, an organization that would be a conglomerate whereby it has several other businesses that offer the similar products or the similar services. So all the businesses or other organizations under this parent company or parent organization, they don't offer similar products or similar services, if that makes sense. Business level strategy. You find out that the business level strategy of an organization directly influences the design of the organization, and the types of those business level strategy would include a defender strategy. So a defender strategy, you will find that in more often than not tall and centralized organization, or what you may call hierarchical organizations, or what you may call mechanistic organizations, right? So organizations that actually adopt this defender strategy, you find out that most often than not, the managers have a narrow span of management, right? Like in mechanistic organizations, because it's quite hierarchical. There are many levels of management. Each level of management or manager would have a narrow span of management rather than a wide span that you would find in organic organizations, right? And most often than not, businesses that adopt this defender strategy, right, you find out that they have a functional approach also to departmentalization, and you find out that functional departmentalization as well is more existent in mechanistic organizations, right? That means also these organizations that adopt this defender strategy, you find out that they also have a bureaucratic approach to organization design to sustain, and also they do so to sustain their competitiveness. Another business level strategy we'll be looking at is the prospector strategy, which you find in flat and decentralized organizations, or what you call maybe organic organizations, right? You find out that organizations that adopt this prospector business level strategy, they have wider spans of management like you see in organic organizations, right? And they are more flexible because those organic organizations, like we talked about in the environment, they exist in environments where there is rapid changes or there is high rate of change. The dynamism is quite high. So you find out that organizations with a prospector business level strategy, rather, they are more flexible and adaptable, right? Also, we have the third business level strategy called the analyzer strategy, which is kind of a go between the defender strategy that is found in mechanistic organization and also the prospector strategy that is found in organic organizations. Now we'll be looking at what you call organizational functions, or what you may call the functional strategies, right? These strategies are less obvious, right? And most often than not are hidden, or actually are engulfed by the corporate or business level strategies or concerns, right? And functional strategies, you find them in functions of an organization. Let's say the function of an organization, like the marketing function of an organization, right? The finance function, HR function, R&D function of an organization. And you find out that such strategies that are adopted at the functional level of the organization or the departmental level of these organizations, right, are done basically to optimize the business functions. Organizational design. Most designs of an organization fall into one of four categories, and others are hybrids based on two or more of the basic categories, right? We'll be looking at functional or U-form design on this slide. And this functional design is based on the functional approach to departmentalization. Down, the U is an abbreviation for unitary, right? Here, for organizations that adopt this functional design, you find out that groups of employees, right, or members of the organization are grouped into functional departments, and such functional departments may be the marketing department, the HR department, the finance services department, and all that, right? Now you find out that considerable coordination is actually required across the departments of such an organization, right? And Such functional design actually facilitates for integration and promotes a functional rather than an organizational focus. What does that mean? When people are grouped into functions, right, or these departments, you find out that most often than not they lose sight of the organization as a whole because they are more concerned with the outcomes of their departments. On this slide, we'll be looking at an illustration of the functional design, right? It says here it's a functional or uniform design for a small manufacturing company. So, because it's small, you find out that the managerial hierarchy is quite reduced in as much as it's most likely a mechanistic organization, right? Which would have a tall managerial hierarchy, but because it's a small manufacturing company, it tells you that the organizational size is quite small, right? Meaning that all these managers right here, that is a reduced hierarchy, they equally may most likely have narrow spans of management because there are less number of employees within this organization. That is why there are reduced number of managerial levels, right? But looking at this, you'll find out that there are the established functions of operations, marketing, finance, human resources, and R&D. And at the top, you see the CEO, which is like a top manager, right? And these vice presidents may be top managers, as the case is, but basically they are heading the functions of this organization, the unique functions of this organization. And you can see further down those hierarchy other managers that report to them. So these are experts, let's say for the operations department, right, as a function of this organization that has this design. All these are in the operations. All these vice president, plant managers, and shift supervisors would be experts in operations. Conglomerate or H-form design of organizations, right? The conglomerate design is used by organizations that are composed of a set of unrelated businesses. And this organization that has this design, the conglomerate design, is serves as a holding company because every business that is under the parent company is unrelated to each other, right? And you find out that for each of those unrelated businesses, there will be a general manager that oversees each of those unrelated businesses, and these businesses would be responsible independently, or the general manager functions independently of the others and is responsible for the profit and losses in their businesses, right? And you find out that the corporate staff that work at the parent organization or at the conglomerate level, right? Those corporate staff evaluate performance of each of those unique businesses or each of those unrelated businesses under the parent company, right? They also are responsible for allocating resources to these organizations in as much as they may actually require the similar resources since they are involved in unrelated businesses, right? And also, this corporate staff would also make decisions about whether to buy or sell any of those businesses that compose the conglomerate. On this slide is an illustration of the conglomerate design at Samsung. You find out that Samsung uses this design because it has a set of unrelated businesses, right? So the corporate level strategy of Samsung may be considered the unrelated diversification, right? Because their businesses, the organizations under Samsung as a conglomerate, they are into several businesses like the semiconductors, telecommunications, appliances, and media. This may be considered unrelated businesses. Divisional or M-form design. The divisional design has to do with when a parent organization has multiple businesses that are related constituting it, right? So it's basically what you call a corporate level. It's akin to the corporate level strategy called the related diversification, right? So when we talked about the related diversification, we're talking about a parent organization that has similar businesses, right? A lot of businesses that are providing similar products, similar services under a parent organization. And the M is basically an abbreviation for multi-divisional, right? Meaning that they have several divisions which are kind of smaller companies offering the same products and services, right? All of them are similar. So some activities in organizations with this design are decentralized, whereas some activities rather are centralized at the corporate level, right? And you find out that the biggest advantage is the opportunity for sharing of resources or for coordination at the corporate level, because since all these organizations require the same set of supplies or resources to function or to come up with outputs, right? You find out that coordination at the top level or at the corporate level is highly required because of the need for all these businesses for the resources provided by the parent organization, right? And you find out that when it's implemented appropriately, that it could actually be a better organization design with regards to performance of an organization when compared to either the functional design or the conglomerate design, if that makes sense. So this divisional design basically results from a strategy of related diversification, meaning different businesses, right, offering similar products or services under one parent company. And the main objective of such a design will be to foster internal competition, since all this set of the sub businesses under the parent company are offering the same products and services. You find out that they will be competing for the same customers. Not only will they be competing for the same resources from the corporate level, right? They will also be competing for the same customers. So there would be internal competition. They are actually scouting for the same customers, but they are under one organization, meaning that allows for internal competition, right? Also, you find out that there's cooperation most often than not when an organization actually adopts this design. And like we said earlier on, research shows most often than not that if it's implemented appropriately, that there could be a better organization design with regards to performance than the functional design and the conglomerate design. On this slide, we have an illustration for an organization that adopted the multi-divisional or divisional design, right? The M-form design, and the organization name there is the Hilton Hotels. You find out that the Hilton Hotels has is into hospitality, and all those hotels like the Conrad, DoubleTree, all those under the Hilton brand. These are different businesses that offer similar products and services, which is hospitality, under a parent company, which is the Hilton. Matrix design. The matrix design is based on two overlapping bases of departmentalization, right? And the two overlapping bases could be have like the design may have elements of the functional departmentalization or elements and overlapping with maybe elements of product departmentalization, right? So two overlapping bases of departmentalization in this case will be there is a base of functional departments with a set of maybe product groups, right, superimposed across them. So let's say there's functional department of like operations, human resources, right, marketing, finance, and you have let's say product groups too, or product departmentalization based on, let's say, in an organization like Apple, who probably, if Apple has like the operations department, HR, finance, and equally has the product departmentalization of, let's say, if it's their PCs, if it's their iPhones, if it's their iWatches, right? Those are different products, and they could have different products as departments within Apple, and they could equally have those functional departments of maybe HR, finance, operations. So if such exists within Apple, then you will find out that such design within Apple is a matrix design, because it's kind of a superimposition of two basic departmentalizations that would provide for the matrix design, right? And you find out that apart from the functional managers, right, or rather the managers that head those functional departments, you may have also a metrics design whereby there are task groups or committees whereby there are equally project managers that head a project group, right, composed of, and the project group or task committee or task group would most often than not comprise members or employees from those functional departments who come together to solve a problem that cuts across departments. So thereby having task groups or committees established within the organization. So you find out that there's the semblance of working in task groups or business units within this organization, as well as working as functional departments. Such design that incorporates both the functional departmentalization as well as maybe the project form or task committee form or task group form that that has a semblance of what you see in the organic organization. That would be a metrics design, right? Now, also the metrics design has what you call a multiple command structure that results when an individual reports to a functional superior and one or more project managers. So it goes without saying from our previous explanation, where a task committee or a task group or a committee is established to solve a problem that cuts across functional departments of an organization, but to allow for ease in problem solving, to actually reduce the bureaucracy by having to involve all the departments, having to select only members of the department to form a task committee to ensure speed in problem solving and data bureaucracy when individual functional departments have to interact to actually solve those problems. So you find out that most often than not, those members or those employees that join those committees, right, they report to the project managers in those committees as well as report to their managers in the functional departments from where they were picked to constitute those committees. That's why it's called a multiple command structure, whereby an employee who is part of a committee and that was actually adopted from a functional department has multiple managers that they report to, right? So you find out that the metrics form is common in one of three situations, right? When there is a strong pressure from the environment. So a strong pressure from the environment will actually provide for maybe problems that require solutions from several functional departments, right? So such pressure or the pressure from the environment might be the need to respond fast, to adapt more quickly to the environment. So in such situations, having to allow functional departments to come solve the problems together may take longer time, right? So to respond in a rapid form towards in response, or rather to respond to the pressures of the environment in a rapid manner, right, they may have to adopt a metrics design. Also, you find out that the metrics design is common too when there are large amounts of information that need processing, right? So you may require experts from different functional departments that have the capability to analyze those information. That would actually require maybe a metrics design, because there will be two forms of departmentalization, such as the project or task committee form, which is like something you will find in an organic organization, versus the functional departmentalization also. Now another situation whereby the metrics design would be most applicable is when there is pressure for shared resources, right? We'll be looking at the advantages and disadvantages of metrics design, right? So you find out that it enhances flexibility, whereby teams that are created can be dissolved as needed. So when, for instance, members of a functional department constitute a task group or committee, right, in this metrics design that exists within an organization that has a functional department and also constitutes committees, you find out that flexibility here will be that those committees or task groups or teams can be created once a problem arises that requires the expertise from different functional departments, and once those problems have been solved, such task groups or committees are disbanded. So that's some form of flexibility, rather than having to maybe establish another functional department that would look into solving that problem. That would be quite rigid, right? So metrics design allows for such flexibility, right? And you find out that team members are more motivated and committed. Now, talk about the motivation. Someone who is probably a high performer in a functional department may actually get bored over time if they do the same things over and over again. But if such person is nominated into a task group or committee to actually showcase their expertise and engage in more problem solving situations, right, they may be more motivated because they are high performers, right, and they may be more committed to the organization. Now, based off this matrix design, you find out employees learn new skills, especially when they are deployed to committees, right, or task groups. They also learn, they also develop skills from other members, from other employees from other functional departments, or also in solving those problems for which they constitute a committee. Some skills may also be developed for such employees from functional departments, right? And you find out that such design allows for efficient use of human resources rather than just narrowing down the use of those employees in their functional departments, right? You could also deploy their expertise into the task groups and committee. That speaks to the optimal or optimum use or efficient use of human resources, which is a resource of an organization that is expected to be managed efficiently and effectively. Now, also it enhances cooperation among those departments that have members, or employees from those functional departments that have members interact, right? So cooperation will be enhanced, especially when employees from different departments interact. That would extend to those various departments by extension, also enhancing cooperation. And it allows for decentralization of power, because most often than not, rather in solving problems, rather than concentrate the power at the top with the top functional managers, right? Such power is there's devolution of such powers to maybe the project managers of those task groups or committees, right? So that speaks to devolution of powers. On the other hand, there are equally disadvantages for adopting this metric design, because there's the complexity of reporting relationships, for instance, right, whereby an employee from a functional department not doesn't just have one manager who is their functional manager, but also maybe reports to a project manager in their task group or committee. So such multiple reporting relationships might actually create for complexities, right? In which case the employee sometimes might be unsure on whether to report more directly to the functional manager or to report more directly to their project managers, right? Also, you find out that another disadvantage will be that some managers view the metrics as a form of anarchy, where they have unlimited freedom, right? So they take advantage of such unlimited freedom. Also, group dynamics would also include will also be included as the disadvantage, because there is increased decision time, maybe individual domination when they get involved in those task groups or committees, right? And they may compromise too much or lose focus, and coordination time may increase, right? So because groups may take longer to make decisions, they may be dominated by one individual, may compromise too much and lose focus on their primary objectives for which they were constituted, right? And more time is needed for coordinating task related activities as well when you adopt a metrics design. On this slide, we can see an illustration of the metrics organization, right, where you can see visibly the functional departments headed by functional managers like the vice president engineering, captured in on the blue vertical on the blue vertical portion of this diagram, right? You have the functional departments of engineering, production, finance, and marketing, whereas you have the task groups or committees, right, in the orange shades in the orange backgrounds rather of this particular diagram, right? You have the project manager A, which is most likely the manager of a task group or committee, and you have the project manager B. So you find out that employees, let's say employees on this first level from project manager A, as much as they report to their functional managers of vice president engineering, production, finance, and marketing, right, such employees as well report to the project manager A, and so on and so forth as you go down to project manager B and project manager C for these employees. Hybrid designs. A hybrid design basically happens when two or more of the common forms of organizational designs are integrated or combined, right? And only a few organizations actually use one particular design in its pure form, like just use one particular design as its only design. You find out that most often than not, organizations hybridize these designs, right? And most firms have one basic design as a foundation, but have the flexibility of superimposing other designs on their primary design. Imagine issues in organization design. The first we'll be looking at is team organization, right? This relies on project type teams with little or no underlying functional hierarchy, right? You find out that with team organization, people float from project to project as necessary or as the case may be, right? Because there will always be problems arising to be solved within the organization, and these employees that float from project to project basically do so by virtue of their skills, right, and the demands of their skills for the execution of those organizational projects. Now, you also have the virtual organization, which is an organization that has a little or no formal structure, right, and facilities and services that are offered by this organization most often than not are subcontracted, and they in most cases use temporary workers or temporary employees, or what you call the peripheral employees, right? And as the situation changes, the workforce changes in parallel. That means that when there is need, the reason basically why they use peripheral or temporary workers is to be able to be flexible enough to train their workforce, as the case may be, if there is there is less need for employees, right? And the ability to actually increase their workforce or increase their number of employees when the need be, right? That's why most often than not they use the temporary or peripheral workers, because if they use permanent or core employees, right, that means even when there's no need for those employees within the system, they can't shrink or they can't let go of them, and that will create for redundancy, right? Also, we'll be looking at what you call the learning organizations, and such organizations basically facilitate for lifelong learning and personal development of all their employees, right? While they continually transform the organization to respond to changing demands and needs of the environment. And you find out that the frequent goals of such learning organizations, will be to improve quality, right? Continuous improvement, performance management. The idea of such a learning organization is continuously immersing their employees in shared learning experiences, right? And such organizations will promote an organic design, right? Whereby people of the organization or employees of the organization most often than not will have common knowledge, they will have shared goals, and they would have shared expectations as well, because they are looking at the organization from a holistic point of view rather than a narrow point of view that is functional in nature, or that is based on departments. So it's like employees of the organization are not parochial, or like they are not only concerned about the outcomes of their departments, right? They are more akin to looking at the organization as a whole and having shared goals, having shared expectations, right? Special issues in international organization design. You find out that an organization design, especially an organization that is operational in foreign markets, right, or that operates global, that has a global marketplace, right, you find out that it's advisable for such organizations to adopt designs that allows it the flexibility of operating effectively in varying in varying geographical locations, right? Because these organizations operate in different global markets, right, or different countries or different foreign locations. Most often than not, their design should allow for flexibility to adapt to these varying or different environments, right? And you find out that managers in such organizations can actually reap the advantages of coming up with a design that allows for flexibility if and only if they can look at it from a strategic point of view, whereby they're looking at it in consideration of the strengths of the organization, right? And looking at they're looking at what are the strengths and the weaknesses of the organization vis-a-vis what are the opportunities and threats that lie in those different or foreign locations where they operate. The diagram on this slide is basically illustrating the common organization designs for international organizations, right, or multinational companies. Now, you find out that the design captured under A would be considered the simplest, really, because it kind of has a functional department that is charged with concerning itself, or rather saddled with the responsibility of overseeing all the international operations of this particular organization. That would be like the simplest form of design, having a functional department overseeing all the international operations. But the 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 diagram captured under B, you will find out that it's kind of an extension of location departmentalization, right? Because you can see um the representations there, like the departments there will be based on locations, right? Whereby you have the North American operations, the Europe and the Asian operations. It's based on those locations. Whereas for the diagram captured under C, you find out that each product manager is responsible for all product related activities, right? Without considerations of what the location is. It's just about the products, right? And they don't have consideration about the location. And the design D is basically like the most typical of larger multinational corporations, right? Because it's an extension of what you call the multi-divisional structure, right? The multi-divisional structure, like we said, has branches located in various foreign markets.